Montana Territory, July 1883. The heat clung to the ground like a second skin, thick with dust and sweat as folks crammed into the town square of Red Bluff. The air stank of horses, tobacco, and something worse, desperation. That was what brought people to a bride auction. That and money. Zadie Kessler stood barefoot on the wooden platform, her dress torn at the shoulder, her lips split, her belly, swollen with child, pushed out against the thin cotton. She stood tall anyway, chin lifted, arms cradling her stomach. She said nothing. She would not beg. Not again. The auctioneer barked prices like a man selling cattle, not people. Pregnant, yes, but still strong. Look at her bones, good hips. She'll birth a healthy one in a month or two. Tops. Who'll give me $30? A few murmurs. A man in a brown hat nudged another, both laughing. A sharp voice cut through the noise. 25, and I want her tonight. The crowd parted around him. Clyde Branner. Greasy curls, boots caked in dried blood, and the stench of whiskey followed him like a shadow. He swaggered forward, already reaching for Zadie like she was a sack of grain. She flinched when his hand grabbed her arm. You'll do just fine, sweetheart, Clyde growled, yanking her toward the edge of the platform. Then came the voice that stopped everything. Do not touch her again. Came low, rough and cold. The crowd turned. A tall man stepped forward from the edge of the square. Dust clung to his boots, his hat pulled low. Rifle slung across his back, holster tied to his thigh. His eyes, pale as winter steel, were locked on Clyde. Who the hell are you? Clyde snarled. The man didn't blink. Name's Jonah Jessup. And I said, don't touch her again. Zadie stared at him, heart hammering. She didn't know this man, but something in his voice, like a rail spike driven straight into the ground, held the promise of protection. You buying her? The auctioneer asked, wary now. Jonah reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a satchel. He tossed it onto the platform with a heavy clink. That's $50. She's mine now. Hell she is. Clyde lunged forward, but Jonah was faster. He stepped between them and drove his fist square into Clyde's face. The crack of bone echoed through the square. Clyde dropped like a felled tree, blood pouring from his nose. Jonah turned to Zadie and reached out his hand. She hesitated. You're safe now, he said quietly. I swear it. She took his hand. He helped her down from the platform, steadying her when her knees buckled. She gritted her teeth, not wanting to look weak, but he didn't say anything, just stayed close, hand gently at her back. They walked through the crowd, which had gone silent. No one moved to stop them. Where are we going? She asked once they reached his horse. Out of here. I got a place near the Flathead line. Quiet. No one'll bother you there. Zadie looked up at him. Why would you do this? He met her eyes. Because no one should be treated like that. Not you. Not ever. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Jonah helped her into the saddle and climbed up behind her. One arm braced behind her to steady her. The warmth of him was solid and sure, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe. They rode until the town was just a smear of smoke behind them. By the time the sun sank behind the mountains, they'd reached a small cabin tucked in a patch of pine. A split-rail fence, a smokehouse, a barn with a mule inside. It was not much, but it was clean and quiet. Jonah helped her down from the horse. You hungry? She nodded. He stoked the fire inside the cabin, set a pot of beans and salted pork to heat, then handed her a tin cup of water. She drank greedily. He moved with quiet purpose, never asking questions, never prying. When she caught him watching her belly, he looked away fast, respectful. Later, after the meal, she sat on the edge of the bed while he rolled a blanket out on the floor. You can take the bed, she said. I am not putting a pregnant woman on the floor. Her voice cracked. You do not even know me. I know enough, he said. She stared at him for a long moment. I was married. He died in a rail accident outside Cheyenne 4 months ago. I had no family, no money. I came west looking for work. Got robbed and left on the road. Some men picked me up and I ended up at that auction. Jonah's jaw tightened. I am sorry. Zadie looked down at her hands. I thought I was done. I thought they were going to kill me. He crouched down in front of her. No one's going to hurt you again. Not while I am breathing. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. He did not touch her, just sat there, steady as a mountain. That night, she slept in the bed, and he kept watch near the fire. 3 days passed. Zadie helped him with small chores, peeling potatoes, hanging clothes, feeding the mule. He made her rest often, always careful with her. They didn't talk much, but something grew in the quiet trust, maybe. On the 4th morning, while they were picking berries near the creek, she stopped and turned to him. You did not have to do what you did back there. Jonah nodded. I know. I do not understand why you did. He looked at her, long and steady. Because I could not stand there and let it happen. Not to you. Her breath caught. She looked away, down at her hands. You are not afraid of me being with child? He shook his head. No. I see a woman who's been hurt, who needs care. I do not scare easy. Zadie stepped closer. You are not like any man I have ever known. And you are not like any woman I have ever met. The wind stirred the trees. Her eyes searched his. I do not want to be alone anymore, she whispered. Jonah reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. You are not. When she leaned into him, he caught her gently, careful of her belly. She rested her head against his chest, and he held her like she was something precious. Neither of them spoke, but something settled between them, something quiet and certain. Zadie was not alone anymore, and neither was he. Morning light filtered through the pine slats, pale and cool. Zadie blinked against it, the quilt tucked to her chin, a faint ache behind her ribs. She shifted, careful of the weight she carried, and listened. The fire had long since gone out. Outside, a saw rasped through with steady, measured strokes. She rose slowly, pulling her shawl tight, and stepped out onto the porch. Jonah stood near the barn, shirt sleeves rolled, shaping fence rails with a drawknife. The scent of shaved pine clung to the air. He didn't look up, but his voice carried. There's biscuits wrapped in a towel on the table. Took a pan of beans out before light. Should still be warm near the stove. Zadie hesitated at the top step. You didn't have to do that. I know. He kept working, the rasp of blade on timber steady. She sat on the bench beside the door, rubbing her arms. You always up this early? I sleep light. Makes the mornings longer. His voice was even, but something about the way he said it told her sleep didn't come easy. She didn't press. Instead, she watched the sweep of his hands, the way his shoulders moved beneath the cotton. There was calm in his work, not just habit. Purpose. You building that fence for anything in particular? Winter'll come down hard once it turns. Need to keep the mule penned. Maybe fix up room for chickens come spring. Zadie lowered her eyes. You live alone long? 4 years. She turned her face toward the sun, letting it warm her cheek. You ever been married? No, a pause. Ever come close? He set the knife down, leaned back against the rail. There was someone, back in Arkansas. Her family didn't think a ranch hand with no land was worth their daughter's hand. Zadie looked at him then, really looked. They were wrong. He met her gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. Maybe, doesn't change what happened. She thought of the child pressing against her ribs, the weight of her own mistakes. I thought I had a life once too. Then it shifted under my feet like sand. Jonah crossed to her, boots quiet on the packed dirt. He didn't sit, just stood beside the bench, arms crossed loosely. You don't have to explain yourself to me. I'm not. I don't know what to do next. You don't have to know that today. The wind stirred the trees overhead, whispering through the needles. After a while, she asked, "What do you do when you're not building fences or saving strangers?" He gave a short breath, not quite a laugh. Hunt deer in the fall. Cut timber. Trade pelts to the mercantile north of here. There's a widow down in the valley raises goats. She sometimes needs help around lambing. Zadie tilted her head. You don't seem like a man who stays still very long. I didn't for a while. He looked toward the treeline. Then I came out here. Figured quiet was better than burying more names. Zadie didn't ask who he'd buried. Some things didn't need voices to be understood. Later that afternoon, she stood in the garden patch behind the cabin, plucking weeds from between rows of beans gone wild. The sun crept higher, and her back ached if she bent too long. Still, the work steadied her. Jonah came around the side, a bucket in one hand, 2 trout shining inside. You mind if I cook them up for supper? She wiped her hands on her skirt. Only if you let me make cornbread. He nodded once. Deal. In the kitchen, they moved around each other with quiet ease. Zadie stirred cornmeal batter while Jonah worked the skillet. The smell of browning fish filled the room, and for a moment, it felt like something close to home. As they sat down to eat, Zadie glanced at the worn copy of the Bible on the shelf. You ever read it? Jonah chewed a bite, swallowed. Sometimes. Not often. I used to think it had all the answers. He didn't look up. And now I think maybe it's a start. But answers come slower than that. He raised his eyes to hers. You got time. They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't the hard kind. Just full. When the sun dipped and the sky turned violet, Zadie stood on the porch, hand resting on the curve of her belly. Jonah leaned against the post beside her, quiet. Have you ever delivered a child? She asked. No, you afraid? He looked at her then, serious and soft. Only if you are. She smiled, small and true. Then I guess we'll be all right. He didn't touch her, didn't need to. His presence was enough. The wind carried the scent of pine and earth, and beneath the stars, for the first time in a long while, Zadie felt the ground hold steady beneath her feet. The child came with the first frost. Zadie's labor started just after midnight, a cold wind rattling the window panes. She gripped the edge of the bed frame, her breath coming shallow, fingers slick with sweat. Jonah had already boiled water and laid out the cloths she'd torn from an old flannel shirt. His movements quiet and sure. Neither of them spoke much. There was pain, yes, but also a strange steadiness between them as though every small act had built toward this moment. Jonah kept his hands clean, his eyes on hers, and when the worst of it crested, he was there, catching the child with a gentleness that near broke her. It's a girl, he said, voice hoarse. Zadie sagged against the pillows, tears slipping without sound. Jonah wrapped the baby in a wool blanket and laid her in Zadie's arms. The child was red-faced and squalling, her fists balled tight, but her breath was strong, and her eyes when they opened were dark like her mother's. Zadie kissed her daughter's forehead, her hand trembling. Hello, little one. Jonah sat beside the bed, elbows on his knees. He didn't touch either of them, but his gaze stayed fixed on the baby, wonder and something deeper flickering behind his expression. She's fierce, he said. Zadie nodded. She had to be. They named her Hazel, after a tree neither of them had ever seen, but which Jonah said grew small and stubborn in the wild. In the weeks that followed, the cabin changed. Not in size or structure, but in feeling. Jonah built a cradle from pine slats and lined it with rabbit fur. Zadie stitched a bonnet from spare muslin. Hazel slept between them the first nights, her cries waking them both, though it was Jonah who always rose first. One morning, as Zadie nursed the child near the hearth, Jonah returned from the barn, his coat dusted with frost. He carried a bundle wrapped in canvas. "Found something I thought you might want," he said, setting it on the table. Zadie opened it slowly. Inside lay a stack of rough pages, her old journal, the one she thought lost on the road west. The binding was split, but the words remained. She touched the pages, stunned. "Where did you?" "Traded a trapper up north for a rifle he wanted. Said he picked it up near the pass. Figured it had worth to someone." She looked up, heart full. "You did that for me?" Jonah shrugged, but his eyes were warm. "Seemed like something you should have back." Zadie set the journal aside and crossed to him, Hazel tucked against her shoulder. "You keep doing that." "What?" "Giving me back pieces of myself." Jonah's glance dropped to the baby, then returned to her. "Maybe I'm just making room for new ones." That night, she didn't ask him to sleep on the floor. The weeks turned to months. Snow pressed down heavy, piling along the eaves. Jonah split wood every morning, and Zadie learned to bake bread with a cracked Dutch oven. Hazel grew fat-cheeked and strong, her laughter bright enough to lift even the shortest days. One evening, with the sun low and the fire humming, Jonah laid a hand on Hazel's back as she dozed in his lap. "I wasn't sure I'd ever have this," he said quietly. Zadie looked up from her sewing. "A baby?" "No. A reason to come home at night." She set her needle aside. "I didn't think there'd be space for another beginning." He met her eyes, steady. "There is, if you want it." She rose and sat beside him, pressing her shoulder to his. "I do." The fire crackled. Hazel stirred, then settled again. Jonah slid his hand into hers, rough fingers twining with hers in a way that felt like promise, not possession. Outside, the snow fell soft and slow, blanketing the world in white. Inside they were warm, together, and they would stay that way. The first melt came slow, drip by drip from the eaves, pooling into muddy ruts beside the cabin. Hazel had learned to grasp with both hands and laughed when the snowmelt ran over Jonah's boots. He let her tug his beard with a solemn patience as Zadie watched from the porch, quilting hoop in her lap, fingers moving steady through blue thread. By March, the ground softened enough to turn soil. Jonah spent 3 days pulling up sod with the rusted plow he'd repaired over winter, and Zadie followed behind, dropping seeds into the furrows. Squash, cabbage, beans, and a small patch of sweet corn. Hazel napped in a basket nearby, wrapped in a linen sheet Jonah had traded for in the valley. That evening, while Hazel slept in the cradle, Zadie poured water into a basin and set it on the table. She stood behind Jonah with a razor in hand, running her fingers along the back of his neck. "I haven't cut a man's hair since my brother was 12, she said. "You sure you remember how?" "I'm about to find out." She worked slow, careful not to nick him. The lamp cast warm light over his shoulders, and the room held that middle kind of quiet, not silence but something lived in. As she trimmed behind his ears, he spoke low. "I dreamed of the war last night. First time in a long while." Zadie paused, comb in hand. It was always winter in those dreams, but this time it was spring. The trees were leafing out, and there was birdsong. She leaned closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That means something to you?" Jonah nodded. "Maybe it means I'm not stuck in it anymore." She set the comb aside and traced her thumb just behind his ear. "You're not here." Jonah turned his head slightly, just enough to see her. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Zadie folded the cloth, brushing hair from his collar. "I used to think I'd have to, but now I think I've got everything I need right here." He reached for her hand and held it without pressing. "I want to build another room off the back," he said. "So Hazel has space when she gets bigger." Zadie smiled, soft and sure. "I'd like that." The next morning, Jonah rode to the sawmill 2 ridges over. Hazel bundled against his chest in a sling Zadie had sewn from flour sack linen. Zadie stayed behind, scrubbing the hearth and washing clothes at the creek. When she returned, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of damp moss and thawed earth. By dusk, Jonah returned with cut boards tied to the mule's pack. He handed Hazel off and unloaded the lumber, then stood on the porch rubbing the back of his neck. "You all right?" Zadie asked. He glanced at the horizon. Passed a man coming down from the north trail. Said there's a rail crew laying new line through the basin. Zadie folded the blanket tighter around Hazel. "How far?" "Close enough we'll see strangers come through." "You worried?" Jonah met her eyes. "Only if you are." Zadie stepped down from the porch and took his hand. "We built something here. Let them pass through. This place is ours." He nodded, the edge of his jaw softening. "Might put up a second gate just in case." The next week, they worked together on the addition. Jonah handled the framing, while Zadie stained each board with linseed oil to keep the damp out. Hazel babbled in a basket nearby, chewing on a carved spoon Jonah had whittled during the long winter nights. One afternoon, Zadie rested her hand on the edge of the half-finished wall. "You ever think about giving her your name?" Jonah set down the hammer and wiped his brow. "I've thought about it." She watched his face, the way his eyes didn't flinch from hers. "I want to raise her with you," he said. "Not just feed her and keep her warm. I want to be her father." Zadie's throat tightened. "Then be him." Jonah stepped forward and took both her hands. "I ain't ever asked you proper, but I'd like to, if you'll have me." She didn't need to think. She nodded, tears slipping quietly over her cheeks. "Yes, I will." They stood there, hands wrapped tight, wind stirring the new leaves in the trees. Behind them, the cabin door creaked open in the breeze, and the scent of early lilac drifted in from the woods. Inside those walls, a new room waited, a new life, a home they had built from the wreckage of the old. And spring had come for them at last. The wedding took place in June, beneath the alder trees that curved along the edge of their field, where the soil held the scent of turned earth and wild mint. Jonah had cleared the brush days before, and Zadie wove a garland from the yellow prairie roses that bloomed low along the fence line. Hazel, now crawling, clapped her hands against her mother's skirt while a warm breeze stirred the hem. They had invited no one. There was no preacher, only a leather-bound Bible passed down from Jonah's mother, and a promise spoken plain beneath the open sky. "I'll keep you," he said, fingers wrapped around hers, "through every season." Zadie's voice trembled, but her words held. "And I'll walk beside you wherever the path goes." He kissed her, slow and certain, as Hazel gurgled against Zadie's hip, and the leaves above them shimmered with the light of early summer. That night, they sat on the porch after putting Hazel down. The moon hung high, the trees casting long shadows across the field. Jonah held Zadie's hand, her fingers laced through his, and rubbed his thumb across her ring, a simple band he'd hammered from a coin once used to buy seed. "Feels like something settled," he said, watching the stars blink to life. "It has," she answered, "but not like an ending. More like the ground finally stopped shifting." He turned to her. "Do you ever miss what came before?" Zadie hesitated, then shook her head. "Only the parts that made me strong. The rest I let go." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek atop her hair. The quiet between them was full not of things unsaid, but of peace earned. The days that followed came rich and green. The garden sprouted thick with promise, and Jonah taught Zadie how to mend harness straps with beeswax and sinew. Hazel took her first step on the packed dirt near the barn, wobbling toward Jonah with arms outstretched. He caught her before she fell, lifting her high with a laugh that came from deep in his chest. That evening, Zadie kept the lantern low as she stitched a hem near the hearth. Jonah carved a toy horse from scrap pine, smoothing the edges until they fit Hazel's palm. The cabin carried the scent of simmered beans and the sharp tang of soaproot drying along the windowsill. Zadie looked up from her needle. "Do you ever think about taking in another child?" Jonah paused, his knife mid-stroke. "You thinking of someone? There's a girl in the valley. Her mother passed last spring, and her father's been drinking since. She's near 10, helps the widow with the goats. Smart. Quiet." Jonah set the carving aside. "You think she'd want to come? I think she needs somewhere steady, like I did." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll go ask her. Together." By the end of that summer, the girl, her name was Clara, had a bed in the new room. She spoke little at first, but warmed to Hazel quickly, and followed Jonah through the fields like a shadow. Zadie taught her to read from the same pages she'd once thought lost, and when Clara smiled, it was like watching something bloom that had nearly withered. In the evenings, they all sat together on the porch, the air thick with honeysuckle. Jonah would hold Hazel in one arm, Clara pressed against his side, and Zadie close by, her hand always resting somewhere he could feel it. "I never thought I'd have this," she said once, her eyes on the children. Jonah kissed the inside of her wrist, his voice low. "We made it." Years passed, and with them came more planting, more winters, more laughter. They kept chickens. Jonah built a smokehouse against the hill. Zadie started a small school in the valley, teaching letters and numbers to ranch hands' children and the occasional trapper's son. Hazel grew strong and sharp-eyed, quick with her hands and quiet with her words. Clara stayed, even after she turned 18, saying only that no place had ever felt more like hers. One spring, she took over the goat herd from the widow and walked home each night by lantern light. Zadie and Jonah grew older together, their hair silvering, their hands still reaching for each other across the years. They woke each morning to the soft sounds of breath and wind and the creak of the house they'd made with their own hands. And when the long years settled around them like dusk, they stood at the edge of their field, side by side, watching a line of green row toward the horizon. "I wouldn't change a single thing," she said, her voice full. Jonah looked at her, eyes steady. "Me neither." He took her hand, and together they walked home, every step a promise kept.